for millennia, they've just commanded our awe, haven't they? These massive structures, rising out of the desert. Ancient Egypt, it always felt so distant, like its secrets were locked away forever.
They really were, for a long, long time. Thousands of years, the language, the key to understanding their whole world, their history, their beliefs, just everyday life.
Yeah.
It was completely silent.
Right, until that one incredible moment, July 19th, 1799. You've got this French soldier, Napoleon's campaign, finds a stone near Rosetta.
That's the one. 3 different scripts carved onto it.
And a stone, the Rosetta Stone, it becomes this totally improbable key to finally cracking hieroglyphs. Suddenly, it's like a whole civilization starts talking again.
Exactly. And that's where we're headed today, based on this fantastic stack of sources you've shared with us. We're going to try and cut through some of the maybe noise, pull out the really important stuff, and get you well informed.
Yeah, our mission today. Well, let's dive into these sources. We want to understand the incredible scale, the grandeur, those achievements that, they still blow your mind today.
But also confront the other side. The often pretty brutal reality of the lives lived in the shadow of those monuments.
Ready to unpack it all.
Let's do it. So, to really get ancient Egypt, pretty much every source starts in the same place. The Nile. Herodotus famously said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile.
And he wasn't exaggerating, was he?
Not at all. The river wasn't just important, it was basically the only reason complex society could flourish there in the desert.
And it wasn't just having water, right? The sources really stressed the annual aspect, the flood.
The inundation, yeah.
Yeah.
Triggered by rains way south, the Nile would swell, flood its banks, spread water, and crucially, deposit this incredibly fertile black silt all over the valley floor.
So when the water pulled back,
You were left with this perfect, naturally fertilized farmland. It made large-scale agriculture possible, which is, the foundation for everything else. That cycle literally set their calendar.
one of the first big farming communities.
Absolutely. But the sources are also quick to point out the flip side. The Nile wasn't always a gentle benefactor. You could be a terrifying master, too.
That gift could turn dangerous fast. So if the flood was too low,
Famine. Just devastating famine. Crops fail, people starve. Simple as that.
and if it was too high,
Just as bad, really. Villages washed away, crops ruined underwater, livestock drowned. It was this constant knife edge they lived on. And you see this vulnerability right from the get-go. The sources mention this legend, King Narmer, maybe around 3000 BC, facing a terrible famine because the Nile flood just didn't come through properly.
wow, so even the king, this supposedly semi-divine figure, was completely at the river's mercy.
Pretty much. It underscores how fundamental that river cycle was.
Okay, so the Nile's the bedrock. How did Egypt go from that dependence to, the unified kingdom we picture? What do the sources say about the very beginnings?
Well, it wasn't always one big country. Originally, it was 2 distinct lands. You had Upper Egypt, that's in the south, upstream.
And Lower Egypt in the north, the Delta region.
Right. And they even had their own symbols. The white crown, the Hedjet for the south, and the red crown, the Deshret, for the north.
Until unification. The sources point to around 3000 BC, give or take. King Narmer usually gets the credit, sometimes identified with manes.
He's the one pictured wearing the combined crown, the Shent, symbolizing rule over the 2 lands. That moment really kicks off what historians call the early dynastic period, roughly 3150 to 2613 BCE.
And this was a period of what, state building?
Very much so. The sources show writing emerging right around this time. The earliest examples found at Abydos. Little tags, pottery marks, seals, basic stuff initially.
So writing develops pretty soon after unification. Suggests they needed it for administration.
Seems likely, yeah. Keeping track of goods, taxes, maybe royal decrees. Though it's worth noting the sources say full sentences like complex grammar. That doesn't really show up clearly until a bit later, maybe the Second Dynasty with King Peripson.
And the sources also mention conflict in this early period. Little villages growing into bigger centers.
Yeah. Exactly. Places like Thenis, Nakata, Nekhen. As they grew, they started clashing. Probably over resources, trade routes, land, water access. The usual suspect.
Consolidating power.
Right. And figures like the mysterious Scorpion Kings, maybe Ka, and certainly Narmer himself, seem to have been key players in these unification struggles.
So after Narmer unified things, what about the other First Dynasty rulers? What do the sources highlight?
They were really focused on cementing this new unified state. Narmer himself campaigned militarily, built things. He married Nithotep, possibly to solidify ties between North and South.
Just more politics.
Then his son, Aha, continued expanding things, seemed interested in religion, and the afterlife sources link him to early mastaba tomb development. Then you get rulers like Djeer and Jet.
And Merneith. She stands out.
She really does. The first one we know of, who seems to have ruled, at least for a time, possibly as regent for her son, Den, it's an early hint that women could hold power, even if it was rare.
And Den himself sounds important, according to the sources.
Yeah, often seen as maybe the greatest king of that first dynasty. A long reign, like 50 years, associated with stability, economic growth, military success. He's one of the first depicted consistently wearing that double crown. Really solidified the image of the pharaoh.
Okay, so the takeaway from this early period, the sources suggest it's this rapid, maybe messy process of building a single state out of competing centers, all balanced on that unpredictable Nile.
That sums it up pretty well. But even that powerful first dynasty didn't end smoothly. Sources mention internal conflict, and the second dynasty that followed, well, the records are patchier, and it seems to have been a more unstable, difficult period for a while.
Until we get to the era everyone knows.
Yeah.
The pyramids, the Old Kingdom. What do the sources tell us about this, starting with the Third Dynasty?
Yes, the Old Kingdom, roughly 2670 to 2180 BCE. This is the age of the pyramids. It really starts with King Djoser in the Full Dynasty.
But the name that jumps out from the sources is Imhotep.
Absolutely. Djoser's vizier, high priest, physician, and crucially, his chief architect. Imhotep is the genius, the innovator here.
He wasn't content with the standard tomb.
Apparently not. Instead of the usual flat-topped mastaba, he had this revolutionary idea: stack them, one on top of another, progressively smaller.
Creating the step pyramid at Saqqara.
Exactly. And, importantly, he decided to build it out of cut stone blocks, not the traditional mud brick. That was a massive leap in technology and scale.
Huge. How tall did it end up being?
About 62 meters, so over 200 feet. For its time, it was the tallest structure on Earth. The sources also mention this whole complex network of tunnels and chambers underneath it.
Trying to outsmart tomb robbers even then.
That seems to be the idea, yeah. Though, as we'll see, long-term success on that front was limited.
So Imhotep and the Third Dynasty, they basically invented large-scale stone architecture for Egypt. They laid the groundwork.
Precisely. They set the stage for what came next, the Fourth Dynasty. That's 2613 to 2494 BCE. This is the absolute peak pyramid building period.
And it starts with Sneferu, Khufu's father. The sources make him sound like he was learning on the job.
Huh? You could say that. A very expensive learning curve. His first attempt, the pyramid at Maitum, seems to have had, well, structural issues. Some sources say it collapsed or was abandoned.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Then he tries again at Dashur with the bent pyramid. You can literally see the mistake. They started too steep and had to change the angle halfway up to stop it from collapsing.
You can see the angle change. Amazing.
Yeah. But he learned. His third attempt, also at Dashur, the Red Pyramid, that's the first successful, smooth-sided, true pyramid, he finally nailed it.
And the sheer amount of labor involved, even just for Sneferu's projects. The sources give some wild figures.
One estimate, maybe exaggerated, but it suggests nearly 1 million people were involved in his building projects over his reign. Whether it's accurate or not, it points to an incredible mobilization of manpower.
Which brings us to his son, Khufu, or Cheops, as the Greeks called him, and the Great Pyramid at Giza. Just give us the headline stats from the sources.
It's just mind-boggling is the word. Built over maybe 20 years, originally stood about 481 feet high, covers 13 acres at the base.
Made of how many blocks?
Over 2 million stone blocks.
Yeah.
And the average weight, 2.5 tons each.
Most unbelievable.
And for something like 300-800 years, it was the tallest man-made structure on the planet.
How they did it. The mystery remains, right?
Yeah.
Sources talk about ramps, maybe internal ramps, levers.
Still debated heavily. But, as some sources point out, archaeological work suggests incredibly sophisticated planning and techniques, maybe involving carefully constructed ramps, possibly internal ones, maybe clever use of levers and water for lubrication. They might not have written it all down because, to them, it was just how you built a pyramid.
Like us not writing down how a screwdriver works.
Kind of, yeah, though on a much, much grander scale.
And Khufu's reign itself sounds like it was powerful enough to fuel this. Where did the wealth come from?
Sources point to military campaigns, successful ones, into Nubia to the south, Libya to the west. Also, trade was crucial, like getting timber, especially cedar, from Byblos in modern-day Lebanon.
Essential for construction, boats.
Absolutely. And there were even big infrastructure projects beyond pyramids. Sources mention the first documented dam, built during his reign in a place called Wadi Jarawi, probably for irrigation or water supply.
It's interesting, the sources contrast the Egyptian view with later Greek writers like Herodotus, who painted Khufu as a tyrant who enslaved his people for the pyramid.
Right. The contemporary Egyptian evidence doesn't really support the slave-built idea for Giza. It points more towards a highly organized, centralized state, using a system of rotating conscripted labor, probably supplemented by skilled artisans and paid workers. Efficient, maybe harsh, but organized.
And Khufu's successors kept building at Giza.
They did. His son, Khafre, built the second pyramid. It looks almost as tall because it's on slightly higher ground. His complex is the one most closely associated with the Great Sphinx.
Ah, the Sphinx. Still arguments about who it represents.
Always. But the mainstream Egyptological view, as reflected in many sources, leans towards Khafre. The face resembles his known statues, and the causeway from his pyramid temple leads right to it.
Makes sense. And then Menkaure.
Khafre's successor. He built the third, much smaller pyramid at Giza. Perhaps a sign that the immense resources required were dwindling, or maybe priorities were shifting by the end of the dynasty.
So moving past the 4th dynasty giants, what changes do the sources highlight in the 5th and 6th dynasties?
There's definitely a shift. The 5th dynasty is sometimes called the dynasty of the Sun Kings. You see a huge emphasis on the sun god Ra. Pharaohs built smaller pyramids for themselves, but also dedicated separate sun temples.
Less focus on the king's personal monument.
It seems that way, yeah. And then by the 6th dynasty, the sources indicate a gradual weakening of that central pharaonic power.
How so?
The priests, especially the Ra cult, seem to gain more influence and land. And the local governors, the nomarchs out in the provinces, they become more powerful, more hereditary, less dependent on the king. Power starts to seep away from the center.
And this decentralization, along with maybe other issues, leads to the end of the Old Kingdom's glory days.
That's the picture the sources paint. Pepi II had an incredibly long reign in the 6th dynasty, like possibly over 90 years. Towards the end, his authority seems to have waned significantly.
90 years, wow.
Yeah, but maybe ineffective for the last part. And then, critically, sources mention evidence of severe, prolonged drought and resulting famine around this time. That combination, weak central rule and climate catastrophe, seems to have broken the Old Kingdom system.
So the key insight from this whole Old Kingdom period isn't just, wow, pyramids, but what they represent. This incredible peak of centralized state, power, organization, resource mobilization, all focused through the divine pharaoh.
Exactly. It's a stunning example of what that kind of focused hierarchical society could achieve, technologically and logistically.
And this is the crucial turn the sources insist we take. This wasn't magic. This grandeur was built by people, millions of them. What was life like for the average ancient Egyptian?
Yeah, it's a world away from the pharaoh's court.
Yeah.
The sources describe a really rigid social pyramid. Top, pharaoh, almost a god. Just below, a tiny elite. Nobles, high priests, key officials, and crucially, the scribes, the literate class who actually ran the administration.
The tiny percentage who could read and write.
Exactly. And beneath them, the overwhelming majority.
Farmers, laborers.
Peasants, yes, the backbone of the economy. And then laborers, craftspeople, and at the very bottom, slaves. The sources are clear. Your typical peasant farmer didn't own the land they worked. They didn't even own the hut they lived in.
Who owned it then?
The king, the temples, the nobles, the high officials. The farmers worked it and paid a hefty chunk of the produce back as taxes or rent. They lived a subsistence life, basically.
What did they actually eat? The sources mentioned diet.
Very basic. Bread, probably coarse, whole grain bread, and beer were the absolute staples. The beer was likely weaker than ours, but a key source of calories and fluids. Maybe some onions, lentils, garlic, dried fish if they were near the Nile or canals. Not a lot of variety or protein for most.
So malnutrition was likely common.
Sources suggest yes, based on skeletal remains. They worked the land for the elite, and taxes, paid in grain, were heavy. They lived right on the edge.
And how did those enormous monuments get built? Who were the workers? You mentioned conscription.
Right, the corvée system. It was basically mandatory state labor. During the inundation season, the Nile flood, farmland was underwater, so peasants couldn't farm. This was the time the state conscripted huge numbers of them.
As a form of tax.
Exactly, or community service, you could say. They were drafted to work on the pharaoh's projects. Quarrying stone, hauling blocks, building pyramids, temples, digging canals, strengthening dikes. This was the primary labor force for the big state projects.
So the idea of slaves building the pyramids isn't quite right, according to most sources.
For the Giza pyramids specifically, the evidence points more towards this corvée system, possibly alongside skilled, paid workers and maybe some people working off debts. There were slaves in Egypt, definitely, but the massive pyramid workforce seems to have been largely composed of drafted Egyptian peasants.
But regardless of their official status, the work itself.
Brutal. Absolutely backbreaking. Imagine hauling multi-ton stone blocks using just muscle power, ropes, maybe sledges, simple levers, and ramps under the Egyptian sun with fairly primitive tools.
And we actually have physical evidence of what this did to people's bodies.
We do, and it's sobering. Studies of skeletons from worker cemeteries, like the ones found near Giza or the village of Dero el Medina, where the Valley of the King's tomb builders lived. They tell a clear story.
What kind of injuries?
Severe arthritis, especially in the back and joints, spinal deformities from years of heavy lifting, lots of bone fractures, arms, legs, ribs, often poorly healed, suggesting limited medical care. Evidence of lung problems, likely silicosis from inhaling stone dust in quarries and construction sites, crushing injuries from falling blocks or scaffolding collapses.
Grim. And you mentioned malnutrition showing up in remains near Giza.
Yes, some studies suggest that even the state-provided rations might have been inadequate or that life was just generally hard. It paints a picture of incredibly strenuous labor taking a massive physical toll.
And separate from this corvée system, there was actual slavery, people owned as property.
Oh, absolutely. The sources confirm this. Slaves were typically prisoners captured in war, or sometimes Egyptians sold into bondage because of debt. They were property, could be bought and sold.
And the sources mentioned some jobs were particularly horrific, even worse than pyramid building, reserved for slaves.
The mines and quarries seem to have been the absolute worst, especially the gold mines out in the eastern desert. One source, Diodorus Siculus, writing later but likely drawing on earlier accounts, gives this absolutely visceral description of the mines at a place called Berm Fawahir. He basically calls it a death sentence.
What did he describe?
Men, women, children forced to work naked underground in horrific heat, chipping away rock with primitive tools, dragging heavy bags of ore. Constant beatings by overseers. Skin scorched and ulcerated, bodies broken, feet bleeding, dying of exhaustion and starvation. He says life expectancy there could be just months.
That's just horrifying. It really makes you rethink the whole structure. The sources suggest this idea of freedom wasn't really the main concept. Serving the pharaoh, maintaining cosmic order, that was the purpose.
Right. Individual liberty, as we conceive it, wasn't the driving force. And when you read descriptions like the mines or look at the physical toll on the free conscripted laborers, well, the practical difference in suffering between a corvée worker on a bad project and a slave might not have felt that vast day to day.
The key insight there seems to be the sheer amount of human effort, pain, and I guess expendability that was considered necessary, maybe even normal, for the state's projects in the elite's lifestyle.
That seems to be the hard truth the sources reveal.
And just surviving day to day beyond the labor was full of other dangers, wasn't it? The environment itself.
Definitely. That life-giving Nile, also incredibly dangerous.
Crocodiles, you mentioned.
Huge ones. Nile crocodiles could get up to 20 feet long, masters of ambush. Sources and archaeological finds suggest they regularly took people, especially children, playing or working near the water's edge.
And hippos. We think of them as sort of doofy, but they were dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. Highly territorial, surprisingly fast and aggressive. They were known to capsize boats, attack people on the riverbanks, probably responsible for more human deaths than crocodiles, some sources suggest.
Wow. Okay, note to self, avoid ancient Nile hippos.
Good plan. And then on land, you had venomous snakes, scorpions. Lions were more widespread back then, too. One source tells a story of a herdsman named Taboo getting mauled by a lion. And just the relentless sun, the heat, sunstroke, dehydration were constant risks.
And basic public health. Sanitation wasn't great.
Not by modern standards, no. Limited understanding of hygiene, issues with waste disposal, contaminated water sources, sort of canals or wells. It meant infectious diseases were just rampant.
What kind of diseases are mentioned or inferred from sources?
Things like dysentery, cholera, typhoid from bad water, smallpox, tuberculosis, pneumonia spread easily. Parasites too, evidence of roundworm, tapeworm is common in mummies. Life expectancy wasn't high.
And the sources highlight the particularly brutal reality for children.
This is one of the most heartbreaking things you find consistently in the sources and archaeological record. Child mortality was incredibly high.
How high are we talking?
Estimates vary, but some suggest maybe 1 in 3 infants died before age 1, and perhaps only about half of all children born survived past the age of 5.
Half. Just half made it to age 5. That's staggering to comprehend.
It really is. Cemeteries are full of tiny graves. Child skeletons are tragically common finds. The causes were numerous. Malnutrition making them vulnerable, infections sweeping through communities, accidents like drowning or falls, animal attacks, congenital problems.
The sources even mention parents might delay naming babies.
Yes, possibly for weeks or months.
Yeah.
Perhaps a way to emotionally guard against the high likelihood of loss. It speaks to how common infant death was.
And childbirth itself was a huge risk for the mother.
Absolutely. Without access to modern obstetric care, things like hemorrhage, infections, preeclampsia, obstructed labor, these were often fatal for the mother, the baby, or both.
Sources mention some pretty grim procedures.
In cases of obstructed birth, sometimes the fetus would be dismembered in the womb to try and save the mother's life. A horrific choice, but sometimes the only one. And this wasn't just a risk for the poor. Even royal women died in childbirth. We have evidence related to wives and daughters of pharaohs like Thutmose III.
And for the children who did survive infancy, life wasn't easy.
No. Economic reality meant kids started working very young, basically as soon as they could walk and follow instructions.
Doing what?
Helping parents with farming tasks, fetching water, gathering fuel, tending smaller livestock, learning a craft alongside a parent or master. In very poor families, sources suggest children could even be sold into servitude to pay off debts.
And that early labor obviously took a toll.
Huge toll on growing bodies. Evidence of anemia, stunted growth, skeletal deformities linked to childhood labor is found in remains.
So this constant presence of death, especially childhood death, the grief must have been overwhelming. But the sources also show evidence of care even after death.
Yes, and it's incredibly poignant. You find tiny coffins, miniature versions of adult grave goods like pottery or tools buried with children, little toys sometimes, mummified infants. There's a famous heartbreaking example from Hawara of an infant mummified with its mother, positioned as if still nursing.
Oh my goodness.
It shows this profound desire to care for them, to keep them safe, to ensure their passage to the afterlife despite the prevalence of loss. The key insight here is just how fragile and dangerous ordinary existence was, constantly shadowed by disease, accidents, and the demands of survival.
A constant struggle. And we haven't even really touched on warfare yet. Pharaohs were often portrayed as warriors, weren't they?
Very much so. Maintaining borders, expanding influence, controlling trade routes and resources like mines, war was a frequent instrument of state policy. The sources are full of accounts of campaigns.
Like who?
Ahmose I driving out the Hyksos to start the new kingdom. Thutmose III's legendary campaigns deep into Syria and Canaan, establishing Egyptian dominance. Sailing disaster Ramses II, the list goes on.
And for the ordinary soldier, what was campaigning like based on the sources?
Grueling and dangerous. Long marches through harsh terrain, often desert. Limited supplies. Then intense close-quarters combat. Think spears, axes, maces, bows and arrows. High risk of injury, obviously, but also death from infection afterwards, or disease spreading through army camps, or just heat stroke.
Any specific accounts that stand out?
There's an officer named Amenemheb who served under Thutmose III. His Tun biography describes fighting in Syria and Nubia, and he mentions things like having to literally climb over heaps of enemy dead during a battle. Pretty graphic.
And the way they counted the enemy dead? The sources mention that.
Yeah, it's quite shocking to our sensibilities. Thutmose III's official annals, for instance, record battlefield tallies by counting severed hands, and sometimes severed penises brought back by the soldiers as proof of their kills.
Just wow. Brutal. And the treatment of captured enemies or conquered peoples.
Generally, not good. Sources describe cities being besieged, sacked, burned. Populations could be massacred or deported as slaves to work in Egypt, often on state projects or in those terrible mines.
Any specific examples of cruelty?
There are accounts, like one about a rebellious Canaanite ruler whose city was destroyed, the ground ritually sown with barley to curse it, and then the captured ruler was publicly hanged from the walls of his own ruined city as a warning to others. Standard practice for rebels, perhaps.
So a life often filled with hard labor, disease, danger, and the threat of violence. It makes their focus on death and the afterlife even more understandable.
Absolutely. The sources show this incredibly elaborate system of beliefs about what happened after death. It wasn't just the end, it was the start of a dangerous journey.
The journey through the underworld, the duat. And the big moment was the judgment.
The weighing of the heart. This was central. Your heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, was weighed on scales against the feather of Mat. Mat represented truth, justice, cosmic order.
And if your heart was heavier than the feather, full of sin, basically.
Then you faced the second death. Your heart was thrown to emit this Terrifying composite monster, part crocodile, part lion, part hippo who devoured it. And that was it. Utter oblivion. Your existence was over.
No afterlife. So the pressure was immense to live righteously, or at least to prepare properly for that judgment.
Exactly. Which is why they put such enormous effort and resources into preparing for death and the afterlife. Tombs weren't just burial places. They were eternal homes equipped for the next life.
Filled with grave goods.
Everything you might need. Food, drink, or representations of them, furniture, tools, clothing, jewelry, games, weapons, even servant statues called shabtas, magically animated to do your work for you in the afterlife.
And the tomb walls themselves.
Covered in paintings and texts, spells, and guides, like the collection known as the Book of the Dead, intended to help the deceased navigate the underworld, pass the judgment, and reach the blessed field of reeds.
And mummification was essential to all this.
Absolutely critical. The belief was that your soul, your bod and ka, needed to be able to return to and recognize your physical body. So preserving the body was paramount.
The sources describe the process.
Yes, a lengthy process. Up to 70 days. Removing internal organs, except the heart, drying the body out completely using natron salt, anointing it with oils and resins, and then meticulously wrapping it in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, often with amulets clucked within the layers for protection.
And for royalty, the scale of preparation was just off the charts. Tutankhamun's tomb being the famous example because it wasn't robbed.
Exactly. Over 5,000 objects crammed into that small tomb. Gold coffins, chariots, furniture, statues, unimaginable wealth. But the sources remind us Tutankhamun's tomb was the exception. Most royal tombs and many elite tombs were plundered in antiquity.
Which brings us to another grim reality the sources mention. Tomb robbery must have been a constant problem.
Huge problem. All that wealth buried underground. It was an irresistible temptation, especially for people living in poverty or during times of instability when state control was weak.
Did the authorities try to stop it?
They certainly tried. Tomb complexes had guards, necropolis police, architects designed tombs with hidden entrances, deep shafts, false chambers, heavy stone portcullises, maybe even curses inscribed, though their effectiveness is debatable. Maze-like corridors in some pyramids.
But it still happened frequently.
Oh, yeah. There are famous court documents, papyri from the reign of Ramses IX in the New Kingdom, detailing investigations into widespread gang activity, robbing tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It seems to have been rampant then.
And if you got caught, the punishments sound absolutely horrific in the sources.
They were meant to be a terrifying deterrent. Torture was standard practice during interrogation to get confessions and names of accomplices. Methods mentioned include twisting limbs, severe beatings with rods, the bastonado on the soles of the feet, possibly applying burning embers.
And execute.
If found guilty, especially of robbing a royal tomb, execution was brutal. Sources mention impalement being staked out on a sharpened pole, beheading, with heads sometimes displayed publicly, flaying alive, even being sealed up in a tomb with carnivorous beetles.
Good grief.
Sometimes the bodies of executed robbers were denied proper burial, maybe even dumped back into the tombs they'd looted to serve as a warning, and, in their belief system, deny them an afterlife.
Why so severe? Just for theft?
It was seen as far more than theft. It was sacrilege. Stealing the grave goods, desecrating the mummy, this threatened the deceased's journey to the afterlife. For a king, this threatened cosmic order, Mat itself. It was a crime against the gods, against the very fabric of their universe.
Wow. Okay, so the key insight there is this incredible tension between this profound focus on achieving eternity and the often violent, desperate realities of earthly life, including attacks on the dead themselves.
Very stark contrast, yes.
So Egypt's long history wasn't just one steady line. The sources talk about these intermediate periods. What were they?
Basically, times when the strong, centralized power of the pharaoh broke down. The country fragmented, local rulers gained power, and things got generally more chaotic.
Like the first intermediate period after the Old Kingdom collapsed.
Exactly. The sources show those provincial nomarchs becoming effectively independent rulers in their own regions. Royal authority vanished. Large-scale state-building projects stopped because the central resources and control just weren't there anymore. We see this reflected in the lack of major pyramids after Pepi II's time, for instance.
And the second intermediate period sounds like it involved foreign influence.
Yes, that's when the Hyksos came in. They were people of Semitic origin, probably from the Levant area. They gradually gained influence and then military control over Lower Egypt, the Delta, ruling from a city called Avaris.
Creating tension with the native Egyptian rulers still holding out in the south.
Big time. There was a long period of uneasy coexistence, then outright conflict between the Hyksos kings in the north and the Theban pharaohs in Upper Egypt. Sources mention the Theban king Sekhon-Retau fighting them and dying violently as mummy shows horrific head wounds.
But Egypt always seemed to pull itself back together eventually.
That's one of the most striking things you see in the sources, this incredible resilience. Sekhon-Retau's son, Ahmose I, successfully drove the Hyksos out, reunified the country, and launched the new kingdom.
The Age of Empire.
Right, a new period of immense power and wealth. And even later, after the new kingdom declined, you see periods of fragmentation followed by reunification, like when Libyan chieftains established the 22nd dynasty under Shoshenq and brought Egypt under unified rule again.
So power ebbed and flowed between the central king and these regional powers, nobles, priests, local rulers over thousands of years.
It was a constant dynamic. But the core civilization, the culture, the language, the religious ideas, they persisted through all these ups and downs, invasions, internal strife, and the sources really emphasize the endurance of the ordinary people through it all.
Which brings us to the end of this deep dive, looking back at the sources. It's this incredible paradox, isn't it? On one hand, the sheer brilliance, the monuments that still take your breath away, pyramids, temples, art, the organization required, just awe-inspiring.
Absolutely. But the sources force us not to look away from the other side. The foundation of that brilliance, the relentless grinding labor, the widespread poverty, the constant threat of disease, early death, violence, the fundamental lack of freedom for most, the shocking child mortality rates.
These achievements, they were literally built with the sweat, the tears, and often the blood of millions whose individual stories are mostly lost to us. The farmers, the laborers, the conscripts, the slaves.
It's that contrast. We have to hold both realities. Their skill, their ingenuity, their sheer human endurance created something astonishing and lasting. But the sources make it clear it came at an immense human cost. Those monuments are testaments to glory, yes, but also stained with the suffering that enabled them.
So maybe the final thought we can leave you with, drawing from all these sources, how does truly acknowledging that human cost change the way you look at those incredible ancient achievements? Does it diminish them or make them more complex?
And maybe, what can we learn from the resilience shown by ordinary Egyptians, facing constant hardship, disease, violence, oppression? Yet they endured. They maintained families, communities, elaborate beliefs about cosmic order and the afterlife. What does that tell us about the human capacity to find meaning, to create, and just to keep going, even when things seem impossibly dark?